The Reformation of Western Thought by Kurt Doolittle. Science as we understand it is an attempt to create a discipline of truthful speech. Science as we understand it does not recognise this attribute of science. Science as we understand it does not include those properties we call costs. Science as we understand it does not include those properties we call moral. Science as we understand it can be extended to include those properties we call costs and morality. Science as we understand it can be restated as the discipline of constructing moral, truthful speech. Science then is identical to epistemology in philosophy, and philosophy en toto as a discipline is begun, as its first purpose with ethics, brackets, morality, close brackets, not metaphysics. Law can be scientifically constructed. Truth, science, law, morality are now identical. All else currently masquerading as philosophy is no longer categorisable as philosophy, but as theology, psychology, or deception. Translating Kantian rationalism into scientific and testimonial speech by Kurt Doolittle. Let's translate Kantian rationalism into scientific and testimonial speech. I am going to teach epistemology by using economics in order to repair much of the damage that has been done to epistemology by Platonists, brackets, mathematics, close brackets, and the rationalists, brackets, Kant, etc., close brackets, and the analytic philosophers, brackets, just about all the 20th century, close brackets. Reality consists of a limited number of actionable dimensions, and by using economics we are able to include all of them, and therefore avoid the errors that the Platonists, rationalists, and analytics have introduced into philosophy. Definitions and series. 1. Empirical. Based on, concerned with, or verifiable by observation or experience, rather than theory or pure logic. Quote, from observation, close quote. 2. A priori. Quote, independent of observation, close quote. There are 3 dimensions to claims of a priori truth claim. 1. A prioricity versus a posteriori. 2. Analycity versus synthesity. And 3. Necessity versus contingency. Therefore, we can produce at least the following spectrum of a priori claims. A. Analytic a priori, tautological. Example, 2 plus 2 equals 4, and all deductions thereof. B. Synthetic a priori. Example, increasing money increases inflation. C. Necessary synthetic a priori. Example, childless woman will have no grandchildren. D. Contingent synthetic a priori. Example, all other things being equal, as a general trend, increasing demand will increase supply. Although we cannot know the composition of that supply in advance, we can identify it from recorded evidence. This produces an ordered spectrum of declining precision. A. Identity, brackets, categorical consistency, close brackets, analytic a priori. B. Logical, brackets, internal consistency, close brackets, necessary synthetic a priori. C. Empirical, brackets, external consistency, close brackets, general synthetic a priori. D. Existential, brackets, operational consistency, close brackets, contingent synthetic a priori, which corresponds to the testable dimensions of numbers. A. Identity, brackets, numbers, close brackets. B. Logical, brackets, sets, close brackets. C. Empirical, brackets, ratios, close brackets. D. Existential, brackets, constructible, close brackets. E. Time is unaccounted for in the a priori model, which corresponds to the dimensions of physical reality. A. Point. B. Line. C. Shape. D. Object. E. Time, brackets, change, close brackets, which corresponds to a subset of the dimensions of actionable reality, the full set of which we express in testimonialism as A. Identity, brackets, categorical consistency, close brackets, point. B. Logical, brackets, internal consistency, close brackets, line. C. Empirical, brackets, external consistency, close brackets, the shape. D. Existential, brackets, operational consistency, close brackets, object. E. Volitional, brackets, rational choice of rational actor, close brackets, change. F. Reciprocal, brackets, rational exchange between rational actors, close brackets, changes. G. Limited, brackets, limits, at what points does the description fail, close brackets. H. Fully accounted, brackets, have all costs and consequences been accounted for, defence against cherry picking and special pleading, close brackets, which together account for the totality of actionable reality, brackets, by man, close brackets, that we currently know of, brackets, and it's quite hard to imagine anything else is possible, close brackets. Deductibility from a priori propositions. Ergo, while one can claim the tautological truth, brackets, the analytic a priori, close brackets, one can claim the ideal, brackets, logical, close brackets, truth, brackets, the necessary synthetic a priori, close brackets. One cannot ever know the non-tautological, brackets, identity, the synthetic a priori, close brackets, non-ideal, brackets, contingent synthetic a priori, close brackets, truth, because we rarely possess sufficient information to do so. What does this mean? It means that we can deduce from analytic a priori and necessary synthetic a priori, but we cannot deduce from general synthetic a priori or contingent synthetic a priori statements, because we cannot know if such deductions are true, brackets, for specific cases, close brackets. So the problem with making a priori claims in economics is that you can say statements, but not about consequences in reality. You can only say, quote, all other things being equal, close quotes, we should observe this effect. You cannot say, quote, we will always observe this effect, close quote. Why? Because we don't always observe such effects, and economics is rife with examples. The most commonly cited being unemployment does not necessarily increase, and prices are sticky, and for good reason. The innovation that Menger brought to the table was to bring the principle of relative change from calculus to economics. The principal contribution of Hayek was to transform the use of materials to the use of information as the model for all social phenomenon. The principal contribution of Popper was to bring the information model to philosophy, and in particular the philosophy of science, and to model scientific investigation on a market. This followed the transition in physics from the use of electromagnetic fields to that of information, which then brought physics and mathematics into full correspondence. What Hayek and Popper and the classicals and the Keynesian all missed, and Brouwer in math, Bridgham in physics, and Mises in economics, and the entire analytic and continental movements missed, was that man cannot make truth claims. For example, we did not think the ideas of time, brackets, velocity of change, close brackets, length, brackets, distance, close brackets, and space, brackets, volume, close brackets, varied. Einstein's discovery was the same as Mises's, Brouwer's and Bridgman's, that all their pretense of axioms are false. If our idea of length and time can be false, every other idea that is obvious to our senses and reason can be false. The difference between economics and physics is in A. Volition versus determinism, B. Reciprocity versus transformation, C. Sympathetic testing of rational choice versus entropy. The scientific, brackets, universal epistemological, close brackets, method. Deflation, 0. The purpose of the scientific method is to eliminate ignorance, error, bias, wishful thinking, suggestion, obscurantism, fictionalism, and deceit from our statements about reality. Dimension, 1. We can make A. Statements about experience, brackets, metaphysical, close brackets, or B. Statements about statements, brackets, ideal, close brackets, or C. Statements about existential properties, brackets, existential, stroke, real, close brackets, or D. Statements about existential cause and effect, brackets, change, close brackets, E. Statements about volition. Closure. 2. No test of any dimension can be completed without appeal to the subsequent dimension, brackets, i.e. Gödel. This is profoundly important. No dimension can provide a self-test, close brackets. Ergo, all speech is deflationary. Critical rationalism. 3. All descriptive propositions of existential cause and effect, brackets, change, close brackets, are contingent. Critical preference. 4. The only method, decidability, between two or more non-false cause and effect propositions, brackets, change, close brackets, is cost. This is a clarification of Occam's razor, and appears to be true, for the simple reason that nature cannot but choose the least cost method, and man generally chooses the least cost method, even if we cannot know the full causal density of his considerations. Due diligence against ignorance, error, bias, deceit. 5. The only method of making a truth claim is to perform due diligence in each dimension of reality, brackets, a premise of the consequential dimension, close brackets, applicable to the cause and effect phenomenon, brackets, i.e. the physical world can't engage in rational choice or voluntary exchanges, close brackets. Darwinian survival of ideas. 6. All propositions, brackets, facts, propositions, theories, close brackets, must survive the market for criticism at the observer mental testing, observer action testing, market application testing, and market survival testing. In other words, the universal epistemological method follows this life cycle. A. Observation. B. Free association. C. Test of reasonability. D. hypotheses. E. Perform due diligence. F. Theory. G. Published to the market for application. H. Survival in the market for application. I. Law. J. Survival in the market for refutation. K. Habituation into metaphysical assumptions. Special cases. 7. This universal epistemological process is universal, despite the fact that various results can be identified with it. Because, just as we find prime numbers largely by trial and error, we find special cases of statements by trial and error. But when we find these statements, we have to ask ourselves, what is it that we are finding? A. Sensations, statements about experiences, brackets, metaphysical, close brackets, or B. Logical, brackets, analytic, close brackets, statements about statements, brackets, ideal, close brackets, or C. Fact, statements about existential properties, brackets, existential, stroke real, close brackets, or D. Theory, brackets, synthetic, close brackets, statements about existential cause and effect, brackets, change, close brackets. E. Morality, statements about volition. F. Testimony, statements about the fully accounted change in state of a given instance of the statement we are making, brackets, for example, I have a credit card report that shows John Doe on the 1st of the 1st 2018 at 4:06:32 exchanged $2 for a Hershey's candy bar at Don's newspaper stand, close brackets. Examples. The most common special cases that we find are those that are impossible to contradict at the same dimension. A. Sense, brackets, metaphysics, close brackets. We cannot sense a ball is green and red all over at the same time. B. Logic. If I issue credit on fractional reserves, I will increase the supply of money. C. Fact. The differences between commodity money and note money include, but are not limited to, liquidity, demand, exchange fee or interest gain, portability, brackets, weight stroke volume, close brackets, reserve risk, vendor risk. D. Theory. All other things being equal, if we increase the supply of money, prices will eventually increase accordingly and lower the purchasing power of payments against debts. Morality. All other things being equal, when we force majoritarian decisions on the polity by using representative democracy, we create a monopoly out of the market for the commons, and eliminate the possibility of cooperating on means even if we pursue different ends. Economic levers. Polities can generally use this series of levers to affect the economy. Near term. A. Monetary policy. B. Fiscal policy, brackets, spending, close brackets. Medium term. C. Trade policy, brackets, import-export policies, foreign trade policies, close brackets. D. Regulatory stroke legislative policy, brackets, also includes the price controls, etc., close brackets. E. Immigration stroke deportation policy, stroke expanded military, WPA, etc. Long term. F. Human capital policy, brackets, education policy, close brackets. G. Institutional policy, brackets, laws, regulations, bureaucracies, institutions, banks, close brackets. H. Strategic, brackets, military, close brackets, policy. Schools of economics. The schools of economics reflect the culture and class of their origins, These groups do not acknowledge that their strategies and biases are as I've stated them here, but their research evidence states the contrary. So I have tried to provide a general spectrum of the institutions by what I understand is their culture/class bias. A. Austrian/Rothbardian, brackets, quote, Jewish, close quote, separatist, close brackets. Rule of credit, parasitic optimum, separatist/anarchism, financial class bias, anti-commons bias. Brackets, as far as I know, no university teaches the Jewish Austrian method, close brackets. B. Masonism, brackets, quote, Anglo-libertarian, close quote, right, close brackets. Optimum rule of law, Nash optimum, minimal state/Christian monarchy. Entrepreneurial class bias, brackets, the only university I know of using this programme is George Mason, close brackets. The quote Mason Libertarian, close quote, school places greater emphasis on maximising voluntary cooperation of individuals and organisations through reduction of impediments to ethical and moral cooperation. C. Classical, brackets, quote, Chicago, close quote, Anglo centre-right, close brackets. Rule of law, ensured Nash optimum, parliamentary state/classical liberalism, middle classes bias, brackets, I would argue not biased, close brackets. All other things being equal, the Chicago school places greater emphasis on policy that ensures against error and failure by seeking formulas and rules that investors, businesses and consumers can predict, thereby preserving rule of law and maintaining the prohibition on discretionary rule. D. Mainstream, brackets, quote, saltwater, close quote, centre-left, close brackets. Mixed discretionary rule, Pareto optimum, social democracy, working class bias, consumer bias, female bias, brackets, anti-male bias, close brackets, minority, brackets, anti-white, close brackets, bias, underclass bias, brackets, anti-entrepreneurial bias, close brackets. All other things being equal, the mainstream seeks to optimise consumption at all levels, using every lever available, favours abandoning rule of law, and adopting rule that is increasingly reactive and discretionary. E. Left mainstream, brackets, quote, saltwater, close quotes, Jewish left, close brackets. Authoritarian rule, anti-aristocracy, brackets, war, close brackets. Extractive maximum, brackets, predatory, close brackets. Socialism/communism. Underclass, brackets, outsider, close brackets, bias. This is the Krugman, Stiglitz, DeLong club of leftist economists maximising both consumption and financial extraction as a means of undermining Western aristocratic civilization and Western norms and traditions and rule of law. Answers to questions. Quote, performative. You keep using that term that I don't think you understand, which is why Kant invented those terms, to conflate the empirical and the rational. He was afraid of the Anglo-empirical revolution, for good reason. Quote, morality, close quote. Correct. Morality, brackets, reciprocity, close brackets, requires inter-agent action. So does all economic activity. Economic activity can consist of moral, brackets, reciprocal, close brackets, and immoral, brackets, unequal, irreciprocal, close brackets, actions. We can make a claim that statements about irreciprocal, brackets, involuntary, close brackets, actions in economics are immoral, or we can claim that they are false. Whether you understand it or not, Mises is saying that it is false, not immoral, when he says, quote, "It's not economics," close quote. Quote, "That you can verify something in reality doesn't mean you need to empirically test it," close quotes. We cannot solve the problem of all things being equal in order to understand why predicted phenomena either vary widely or do not exist. The neutrality of money does not appear to exist, because relative changes can propagate into various niches that absorb those changes, just like pennies being lost in landfills, brackets, so to speak, close brackets. Quote, "I can observe that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but I don't need to design an empirical test to prove it," close quote. Yes, but then it's a tautology, whereas nearly all economic phenomena are only general rules. Quote, "Likewise, I can observe that minimum wages increase unemployment, all other things being equal, but I don't need to conduct an empirical test to prove it," close quote. That's just the thing. We aren't trying to prove that it should increase unemployment, only that it turns out that a lot of the time it doesn't. Or rather, that the consequences of it are externalised and invisible. So where does it go? Well, first, it increases prices to consumers in the case of minimum wage workers. It maintains employment, but it prevents rotation of new workers into the economy. And the question is that a net gain or a net loss for everyone? Well, it's immoral to both conduct the test and the consequences are immoral. But does that mean that those consequences are not empirically measurable and therefore whether the policy is net beneficial? That is what economists measure. Secondly, if we think some good is achieved through raising the minimum wage, how can we accommodate the externality of lower rotation through the job pool? For example, what if raising the minimum wage prevents least common denominator service economies? Brackets, racing to the bottom, close brackets. Is that something people prefer? In other words, would you rather have better service and higher unemployment, brackets, greater subsidies, for non-performers, close brackets? The underlying question is this: if prices are increasing profits, can we capture more of that increase for hourly employees than we do for the management, owners and investors, brackets, creditors, close brackets? So there is no difference between increasing the supply of money in order to temporarily increase consumer purchasing power at the expense of debt holders, and increasing the minimum wage in order to capture a rise in prices for labourers at the expense of owners and investors. Or stated even more simply, given that economies are always changing velocities, can we redirect the change in state between participants without, quote, "killing the goose," close quote, brackets, destroying the system of production, close brackets? Well, the answer is a moral one, not a logical or empirical one. And the reason to claim otherwise is the use of false pretense of unscientific or logical positivism, or a priori, or logical contradiction, to create a straw man as a means of preventing investigation into the science of economic immorality. Economic manipulation by the forcible involuntary transfer of property between individuals, brackets, which is exactly what Mises and Rothbard were doing, shaming via straw man using obscurantism, by overloading even well-intended people with half-truths that when fully expressed are false, close brackets. That's the question people ask with these issues. No one questions if it will increase unemployment. They question the limit before it increases negative unemployment. The same as taxation. No one questions that taxation will produce declining revenues. But empirically, what is the maximum taxation that the government can achieve before that happens, and what are the consequences. In closing, now you probably have an idea how profound this bit of text is, and I suspect you could spend a few months integrating it into your thought process. But that's in large part the state of art in epistemology.